Hello, wonderful to have you here. Today I want to discuss a topic of some depth and even maybe a little controversy in Buddhism, which is the Buddha's views on anger and hatred. Now, some of us will know that anger, hatred is one of the three fires or three poisons that are our aim in getting rid of when we're engaging in Buddhist practice. Those are, we might say, hatred, greed, and ignorance or delusion. So these three fires, these three poisons, they're basically sort of the root causes of all of our suffering, of all of our difficulty in life, at least the part that we can deal with. However, there's a question as to whether there is a difference that we should be aware of. In other words, is the Buddha really opposed to or trying to target all of anger and hatred? Or instead, is perhaps there a distinction to be made between, let's say, hatred on the one hand, which is bad, and anger on the other, which is something that perhaps we might want to cultivate in some situations? For example, some people promote the idea of righteous anger, that we should be angry in certain situations, or that the Buddha might have believed that we should be angry in certain situations where we're in the right, where we're perhaps fighting for something that's just, that we're righteously angry, and that way we can separate that, perhaps we might argue, separate that from hatred on the other hand. In other words, perhaps we need anger to keep us safe, or anger to deal with difficult people, anger to deal with difficult situations. So what I want to do in this video is to look at a few key suttas, a few key documents, discussions, dialogues from the early tradition, to see what the Buddha had to say about these kinds of topics. And I think when we look back at the early tradition, what we find is a pervading sense of pacifism, that the Buddha's philosophy was, if anything, extraordinarily pacifist in its aims. Now, I think many of us may have heard the famous verse from the Dhammapada being perhaps the most famous collection of early Buddhist sayings. And here the Buddha says, "Hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hate alone does it end. This is an ancient truth." And here what the Buddha wants to say is that we should not be using hatred against hatred. We will find people hating us in life. We will find people directing hatred in our direction. But if we return hatred with hatred, nothing will end. The cycle will continue. By non-hate alone does it end. And that may mean both that kindness may help end hatred, but it may also mean that a sense of equanimity, perhaps not even being kind, but at least not returning hatred for hatred, is the sort of thing that we should at least consider if we want to end this cycle, this destructive cycle of hatred towards one another. And the Buddha seems to have lived this philosophy in his discourses. One of the perhaps most pointed examples is in an early discourse called the Simile of the Saw, which I've discussed in a number of past videos. This sutta begins with it's sort of structured around a discussion with a particular monk named Paguna, who has been getting too close to the nuns. Some of us will know that there was a distinction between the monks and the nuns in early Buddhism. They basically went in separate groups because the Buddha felt, perhaps reasonably, that there might be problems if the nuns and monks got too close to one another. There might be the opportunity for romantic relationships, which was not the sort of thing that they should be pursuing, given that they were monastics, obviously. So Paguna was getting too close to the nuns, and as a result, he was chastised for that behavior by some of his fellow monks. And Paguna got very angry at being chastised. And so this anger that Paguna felt, this anger that he showed towards his fellow monks, that was the occasion upon which the Buddha decided to give this discourse, which is basically a discourse on anger and how we deal with anger. And in particular, the Buddha looks to the origins of anger. In this particular case, Phaguna got angry because of being criticized, because of being subject to what we might term harsh speech from his fellow monastics. And so the Buddha said, how should we respond to criticism? How should we respond to harsh speech that's directed towards us? The Buddha said, our minds will remain unaffected. We will blurt out no bad words. We will remain full of compassion with a heart of love and no secret hate. That is, our minds should remain unaffected. We should not become angry ourselves. We should not become upset over harsh speech directed towards us. And to make this example even stronger, the Buddha says that even if we are to be physically attacked by people with fists, with stones, with sticks, even with knives or swords, we should remain the same way. We should remain mentally unaffected by it, with a mind of compassion and not a mind of hatred. Indeed, the Buddha went on even farther and said, and this is pretty clearly directed at Phaguna himself, that even if somebody, some horrible person, was to attack the nuns with fists, with stones, with sticks, even with knives and swords, still Phaguna, and indeed all the monastics, all people who were listening to the Buddha, should not respond with a mind of hatred, but rather with a mind of compassion and kindness. Now, to many of us, this will seem shocking, but we have to be clear, the Buddha isn't saying that we can't defend ourselves. The Buddha's not saying we can't defend somebody else who's being attacked. But what he is saying is that if we do that, if we're going to defend ourselves or someone else, we should do it with the right mindset. That is to say, with a mind of compassion. Compassion for both the attacker and the person being attacked. We should not do it with a mind of hidden or overt hatred. That is, I think, quite a surprising, even a shocking kind of recommendation. And most famously, at the end of the sutta, the Buddha gets around to the example that gives the sutta its name, the example of the two-handled saw. The Buddha says, even if low-down bandits were to sever you limb from limb with a two-handled saw, anyone who had a malevolent thought on that account would not be following my instructions. Now, once again, this is a shocking instruction, I think, for many of us. And when I read some people interpreting this instruction of the Buddha's, some people seem to be so shocked by it that they simply don't accept it. In other words, they seem to say, I've read people saying things like, oh, well, the Buddha didn't really mean this. He was just being sort of overblown here. He'd sort of gone too far. He was given an example that he wasn't serious about. But to be honest, I don't think that that's correct. I don't see anywhere else in the suttas that would lead me to believe that's the case. In other words, I think the Buddha was being absolutely serious here. I think he really was suggesting that we at least strive to react in this way. Now, again, that's not saying we shouldn't defend ourselves or defend others. That's a separate issue. However, he is saying that if we're going to defend ourselves, we should do it with the right mindset, and if we are in a situation in which we cannot defend ourselves, somebody overpowers us, we should nevertheless maintain the same mindset. And having a mind, preserving a mind without hatred and without malevolence is going to, I think, inevitably temper our reaction to violence of the sort that the Buddha suggests in this sutta. In particular, it's going to make us less likely to be violent ourselves in response. Because if we respond to somebody who's being violent with a mind of kindness, with a mind of calm, with a mind of love, as the Buddha suggests, we're going to be less prone to try to harm them simply out of anger or out of hatred. We're going to be more prone to do the sorts of things that make, let's say, that make for a better situation, that try to de-escalate rather than harm the other person. And further, if we're able to get ourselves out of this situation, it's going to make it much less likely for us to bear a grudge in the future. After all, so many issues of violence, hatred, dislike in the world go on for years, decades, centuries, lifetimes, simply out of grudges that one person has for another or one set of people has for another. I think we can see this around the world with different religions and belief systems, where people will do things nowadays based on grudges that have been held over centuries and even millennia. However, if we approach these problems, even problems of deep violence, without hatred, and admittedly this is extremely difficult, but if we are able to do that, we're more likely to give up these grudges because we're not going to have them in the first place. Now, none of this requires us, and I have to repeat this because I think it's so important to say, none of this requires us to be blind to injustice or people who are doing things wrong. We have the responsibility at times to respond to injustice ourselves. The only question is what the mindset is. Sometimes dangerous people, people doing wrong things, are going to need to be dealt with. They're going to need to be restrained for their own good as well as the good of the people around them. And I did an earlier video on this general topic of sort of self-defense within the early Buddhist Sangha. There are a few stories that reveal aspects of this kind of self-defense that I'll leave a link to that down in the notes in case you're interested in hearing more. But it does mean that we're not going to want to respond with retribution for its own sake. That is to say, our response to injustice, our response to wrong, our response to violence is not going to involve making the other person suffer simply to make them suffer. That's a response based around hatred, based around dislike of the other person, rather than one based in compassion. In one early sutta called the Subhasita Jaya Sutta, or the sutta on the victory by good speech, there's the Buddha describes a conflict between the gods and the demons. And the gods and the demons, again, they've had this conflict. We can presume it's been going on for a while. And they decide to resolve their conflict by a kind of a form of debate between the chief god and the chief demon. That they're going to have a kind of a back and forth debate on the topic, at least as it seems, of dealing with foolish people. What's the best way to deal with foolish people? And so this debate begins with Vepachitti, who is the chief demon. And Vepachitti opens the debate with his claim about how we should deal with foolish people. Vepachitti says, "Fools would vent even more if there's no one to put a stop to them. So an intelligent person should stop a fool with forceful punishment." So Vepachitti essentially recommends a kind of a response through anger, through hatred. That we should deal with foolish people, we should get angry at them, we should punish them, they should suffer for their foolishness, and that'll make them stop being so foolish. On the other hand, then, having made his point, then Sakka, who is the chief god, responds. And Sakka says that we should deal with foolishness by remaining calm and composed, by remaining equanimous, that is the best way to deal with foolish people. And indeed, that is the way to deal with anger, because there's going to be, and indeed in this sutta, there is a kind of a melding of these two ideas of being foolish and being angry, that the foolish person is somebody who does indeed get angry. So again, Sakka says that we should deal with anger, deal with foolishness, by remaining calm, by remaining patient. Vepachitti, however, doesn't agree with this. Vepachitti finds fault with Sakka's argument here, with Sakka's claim, and Vepachitti responds, "When a fool thinks he puts up with me out of fear, the idiot will go after you even harder, like a cow chasing someone who runs away." In other words, what Vepachitti says here is that the fool is going to see your patience, see Sakka's patience, and mistake it for fear. He's going to think, Sakka's afraid of me. That's why he's staying so quiet and silent. And so the fool is going to redouble his efforts and make even more mischief than he would have otherwise. But in response, Sakka says, well, let the fool think what he wants. I mean, it doesn't matter what the fool thinks. And Sakka goes on to argue. When you get angry at an angry person, you just make things worse for yourself. When you don't get angry at an angry person, you win a battle hard to win. When you know that the other is angry, you act for the good of both yourself and the other if you're mindful and stay calm. People unfamiliar with the teaching consider one who heals both oneself and the other to be a fool. Now, there's a lot to unpack here in Sakka's statement. First of all, what Sakka says is that basically getting angry at an angry person is only going to make things worse. And here we can think right back to that Dhammapada quote that I started off this video with, that anger isn't ended through anger. Indeed, political scientists have noticed something that's called the backfire effect, where in arguments, in debates, people can end up clinging to their own views much more strongly by being confronted with contrary evidence. Now, ordinarily we would think, oh, people are rational, people think rationally, so therefore when somebody is confronted with contrary evidence, they'll stop believing what they believe, or at least they'll believe it less strongly. But as I say, in certain circumstances, in particular, heated circumstances of political debate or other kinds of debate in which we get angry, when we're presented with contrary evidence, it only makes us believe what we believe more strongly. We cling tighter to our own beliefs. It just raises the temperature of the debate rather than cooling it down. And this is a way in which arguments and disputes can only inflame hatreds and make them worse, can only make disagreements worse. The second, I think, key point in Sakka's argument here, in Sakka's verse, is that overcoming our own anger is a battle that's hard to win. In other words, there's courage, true courage, in giving up our own anger. And this is, I think, such an important point to make, because so much of our ideas of courage are bound up in anger and hatreds. This is, I think, an aspect of what we might term sort of toxic masculinity. This notion that to be a man or to be someone who's courageous, and oftentimes these two things are brought together. We think of the two as the same, which again is another problem, but nevertheless, we think of courage and anger as sort of going together, that one cannot be courageous without being angry in a certain sense. And here, Sakka is saying the reverse. He's saying that the true courage, the true victory here is in overcoming our own anger. And here I think Sakka, and indeed the Buddha himself, are skillfully reframing the issue of courage, moving courage over to our own abilities in this way, rather than in the direction of unskillful means. The third key point here in what Sakka says is this idea that when you know the other is angry, you act for the good of both yourself and the other if you're mindful and stay calm. There's a famous early story in the Buddhist suttas where the Buddha is confronted by an arrogant Brahmin who basically tells him off, who says nasty things to the Buddha. And the Buddha, at least in the story as it's described, the Buddha remains calm. And the Buddha just tells this Brahmin basically, I don't accept what you've said to me. I don't accept these nasty things you've said. And since I don't accept them, they remain your own. And you can take them and go off with them if you would like, basically. And so since the Buddha is able to respond with such poise and such calm, he actually is able to turn the Brahmin to accept him. And indeed, the Brahmin at the end decides to become a follower of the Buddha. The basic point here is that we can be much more skillful in responding to anger if we don't get angry ourselves. If we can respond calmly, by surveying the situation, deciding the most skillful way of responding, rather than in a sort of a knee-jerk fashion out of a response of anger ourselves. And in this way, as Sakka says, we can heal both ourself and the other. We're healing ourselves by healing our own tendency to anger, by remaining mindful, by remaining equanimous in the situation. And we can help heal the other person by healing their anger too. Because if we don't get angry in response, we're making it more likely that the anger that they display is going to dissipate over time, and they're going to see things in a better way in the future. Now, as we'll recall, Sakka and Vepacitti were having this debate, and there are a panel of judges here that are listening to the points that Sakka and Vepacitti have made. And at the end of this debate, the panel decides that Sakka has won, because Vepacitti's advice would only result in more argument, anger, dispute, violence in the future by promoting such violence in its reaction. So if we'll recall, that was Vepacitti's point, is that we should deal with the fool here, the fool really meaning the angry person, by punishing them. But the punishment only causes the problem to persist, whereas Sakka's advice helps deal with the problem, as indeed we saw in the Dhammapada quote at the very beginning. Now, a couple of really important points to make here. First of all, as I think you probably already know, these are really difficult practices. Now, we're not talking about something that's going to be easy to do. I myself am very quick to anger in certain circumstances. I've known this for most of my life. A lot of my practice is dealing with that tendency on my own behalf. And I think I've made some progress, although I'm far from being at the end of this path. Let me put it this way, we should avoid becoming angry with ourselves when we find that we're unable to overcome our own anger towards external phenomena or towards other people. Because that, again, just causes the problem to persist. We should be aware that these are difficult practices, that the Buddha was talking in the main to monastics here, that is full-time practitioners who had devoted their lives to the Dharma. Many of us have ordinary lives where we don't have the kind of time to pursue practice 24/7. So, just be aware that these are the goals, but may not be where we are right now. The second, I think, important point to make is that many people will, and I've heard the argument made, they will say that anger is crucial because anger provides us with motivation to do things. And indeed, it's absolutely true that anger provides us with energy and motivation to get things done. However, in my opinion, and indeed I think in the Buddha's opinion, there are better ways to be motivated. We can be motivated, for example, by compassion. We can be motivated by love, by kindness. We can be motivated by the sheer desire to make the world a better place or to help other people. Now, these may not seem as motivating to you right now, but I think if we undertake a practice of bolstering our compassion, of bolstering our sense of kindness and wishing to help others, that may seem less so. In other words, we may get more energy out of such desires in the future. So to return to the question that I started off with in this video, I don't think the Buddha ever made a distinction in the early texts between what we might term anger and hatred, as though anger might be justified while hatred was not. I think, to my knowledge, from my understanding of the early suttas, for the Buddha, anger and hatred were all of a piece. Now, of course, hatred is a more intense form of anger, and as a consequence is going to be even more problematic, but it's not as though there's a good kind of anger. Anger for the Buddha was all of a piece. It was a problem. It was something that we had to overcome. If you know of any suttas where the Buddha says something different, I would be interested, and you can put those down below in the notes, but I don't know of any. On the other hand, it is certainly true that the Buddha was many times quite stern with, let's say, people, monastics who misbehaved or who mistook or misunderstood the Dharma. And in those circumstances, the Buddha could be quite harsh with them. He could use quite harsh words. Words that to me and you might sound angry, or at least when we read them on the page. However, I think that at least there is an argument to be made that the Buddha was not doing these out of anger. He was doing them out of compassion. In other words, he wasn't harming the people. What he was doing was pointing out to them in a very overt way that they were making a mistake, in the hopes that by being so blunt and overt, he could change the way they actually believed and behaved. So he was trying to help them out, is the basic idea. And one very famous example of this is a mistake made by an early monastic, which I discussed in an earlier video of mine, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen in case you want to learn more about the way the Buddha could react to these kinds of situations. So if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and consider helping out the channel and the work that we're doing here together. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video.